Christopher Hitchens here. What shall I say to introduce myself? I write a column for a small faith-based magazine called Vanity Fair. I'm a book critic for The Atlantic. I'm a speaker and polemicist. I've published a few books, the most recent of which was called God, or is called God is Not Great. Any more of this and I would seem solipsistic.
This is Eric Alterman. I'm a former colleague of Christopher's at The Nation, where I write a media column. I also am employed by the Center for American Progress and Media Matters for America, where I write a blog called Altercation, and my most recent book is called Why We're Liberals. I'll start, because usually when people do blogging heads, somebody is asked to come up with a series of topics, and I always refuse to do that because I'm working for free, and it's bad enough that I do the camera thing for nothing. But because this is Christopher's first time ever, they asked me to come up with topics, and again, I still didn't want to do it. But I came up with the topic of why Christopher has been wrong about almost everything, or virtually everything, he's said and done since he became a conservative. And he may dispute the fact that he's become a conservative. We can talk about that. I don't think the label's important. But Christopher, why don't we start with you offering your defense of the position you took in the 2000 election, which, as I recall, was I may be wrong, but as I recall, you supported Nader because you didn't think Bush would be so bad.
I supported, well, just thank you first for that preface. And though it's a high price to pay, since the subject is how wrong I am, at least the subject is me. So that's something, I guess. And I knew that would happen. My daughter came in as soon as I started. Let me see. I'm not a conservative of any kind, except possibly a neo one, though I think that I do believe labels matter and their accuracy matters too. That there's nothing really conservative about being a neo, because the neoconservatives, after all, are people prepared to make war upon the status quo, which is the antithesis of what Edmund Burke or anyone else would have called conservative. However, exactly. Sometimes one has to accept some kind of a label, and I suppose I cheerfully accept at least part of the insinuation there. When I recommended a Nader vote in 2000, I'm having to think back a bit over what I wrote. It wasn't that much about it, but my main concern was that the election itself had been phony. The conventions had been and felt prearranged, as had many of the primaries, that the debates were fixed, Nader was excluded from them, that with the complicity of the press and our profession, that a sort of bogus election was taking place, and it was a vote against that kind of Al Gore, LAPD, Los Angeles convention, and George Bush in Philadelphia being totally stage managed, that I felt it was appropriate to vote for Nader. Of course, at that point, I had no idea that the United States would be the target of a new offensive from theocratic totalitarianism, and if I'd had any inkling of that, and actually I can't completely acquit myself, I did have an inkling of that threat, I wouldn't have been so irresponsible as to vote for someone who doesn't recognize the threat when he sees it.
Well, okay, let's then get to the meat of the problem. Had Al Gore been president, the response to Afghanistan probably wouldn't have been much different than it was. But certainly the response to Iraq would have been quite different. There's two ways to talk about Iraq, I guess. You and I, you may remember, I think just about the time the war began, we had a debate on Charlie Rose.
Yes, I do remember.
Where you and I tried to raise the point then that it gave me pause, leaving aside the pros and cons of the argument. It gave me pause that the United States was pretty much all alone in going to war with Iraq. That yes, we had Tony Blair, who was playing a role that he may or may not have even believed in, but he thought it was necessary for Britain to be involved. But basically, George Bush and and his supporters were saying, we are right, the entire rest of the world is wrong about this threat. And I wonder why that didn't give more pause at the time, and I wonder if you've given any thought to that question.
Well, to answer your question in reverse order then, no, it would never bother me if I was told I was the only person who held the position that I held. I mean, that doesn't strike me as a criticism at all. It's like being told that your views are not in line with the most recent opinion poll. It isn't even the constituent of an argument. That's the first thing. The second thing is, going back now to the beginning of what you said, I'm not so sure that you're right, not that I particularly care what Al Gore thinks about these things, that his policy on Iraq would have been as different as you like to imagine, or as he now pretends that it would be. After all, the speeches made by President Clinton and Vice President Gore about Saddam Hussein, about his fooling around with weapons of mass destruction, about his support for a wide range of international nihilist and terrorist groups, and his general threat to his neighbors in the Gulf, are all very much on the record, and at the time of the election were much more militantly phrased by Gore than by Bush. Indeed, you must remember, Eric, that in the Bush-Gore debates, Bush criticized Gore's support for humanitarian intervention by US military forces, for example, several times, argued that this sort of thing was irresponsible, spoke as if he was an isolationist. I invite anyone who's watching this to look up the speeches made by Gore, and particularly the one made by Clinton at the Defense Department. Now, to the point of being all by yourself, actually, while George Bush was still governor of Texas in 1999, Bill Clinton was still president. Tony Blair made a very important speech in Chicago saying that it was very good that he and Clinton had got rid of Milosevic in Yugoslavia, but that there was another threat, a more grave one, that would have to be faced sooner or later, and that was the ownership of the country of Iraq, the whole nation and state and people of Iraq, by the psychopathic crime family headed by Saddam Hussein. And that there was no way of getting around this huge obstacle in the path towards having a civilized international community. Blair was right then, and he's been right since.
Well, on the point of Gore, it seems to me impossible to argue away the Commonwealth Club speech he gave well before we went to war, in which there was no room at all to go to war under the circumstances that Bush took us to war. With Clinton, it's slightly different. Clinton probably would have liked to have gone to war under the circumstances, under better circumstances than Bush went to war. And it's possible, people like Jamie Rubin were saying that they probably would have gone to war because they think they would have been able to bring around all of the France and Germany in particular. But the fact is that I don't think you can argue that any Democratic president would have gone to war under those circumstances. And, you know, in light of, not even in light of what happened, because it was clear at the time, it's true, a point that Hawks and you've made many times, I suppose, that the containment regime had broken down, but it also was rejuvenated. We had troops, we had Saddam Hussein surrounded, we had international support for containing him. The whole thing was working again, and the war at that point, if it was about preventing further aggression on the part of Iraq, was unnecessary. And again, there was little proof he hadn't committed any kind of aggression against any of his neighbors in a very long time. There were many signs that the weapons of mass destruction had been fully degraded. And we also knew at the time, anyone who cared to look, that the Bush administration was not only